Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Pooja Mehra. The headlines this week are dominated by very disturbing cases of violence against women. Rarely does national attention focus on such crimes. The last time this had happened, we had seen an economic policy response to this complex problem that involves social, economic, political, and many other factors. After the Delhi rape case in 2012, the Finance Ministry had announced a Nirbhaya Fund, an example of integrating gender sensitivity into budgeting. It is worth asking, though, what the fund has accomplished in all these years. Integration of gender sensitivity into macro policy and macroeconomics is a relatively nascent area of work, but it's a very important revolution. The frameworks for fiscal, monetary, and trade policies and analysis tend to be rigidly focused on GDP growth. But GDP growth does not cover most of the work that women do, such as the work they do on family-owned farms. Does this not mean that macro policy bypasses these women completely? The reason why policies, including gender policy and budgets, are not as focused on gender issues should be obvious. Policies are not framed in vacuum. The calculus of voting and voter consent determines policies to a large extent, and gender issues rarely figure prominently as an electoral issue. This is not a gap in economics alone. It's certainly not merely a technical issue. The political economy at play cannot be overlooked. Economists have to continuously engage with heterogeneous stakeholders such as parliamentarians, bureaucrats, civil society, all of who have a vastly different range of incentives and objectives. If the office of the Prime Minister sets up a special cell devoted to integrating gender sensitivity into policies, then it may become possible to build momentum for doing so. Globally, the work to orient macroeconomics and macro policy towards people-mattered policy initiatives has just begun to pick pace. The former US Federal Reserve Chairperson Janet Yellen is among those who have got involved with this movement. My guest today is the macroeconomist from India who works in this area. She is Dr. Lekha Chakrabarty, professor at the National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. I asked her about the way macroeconomics needs to change to become more gender sensitive and the progress so far in doing this. Lekha answered my questions so patiently and indulgently that the conversation ran for over an hour. So we've split it into two parts. This week we are releasing the first part, which is mainly about what does integrating gender into macroeconomic policy mean, why it is required, and what changes need to be incorporated into it. Next week, we will release the concluding part in which Lekha talks about the challenges that economists like her are up against in their endeavor to integrate objectives of gender and human development into macro policy. Hi Lekha, welcome to Everyday Economics. Thank you so much for taking out the time, and I'm really excited about the topic we're going to talk about today.
Thank you so much, Pooja, for having me.
So let's start immediately because I have a long list of questions. I want to learn a lot. In fact, everything that I'm going to know about this subject is what I'm going to learn today from you. And I'm going to straight away start with my question.
Sure.
What does integrating gender into macroeconomic policy mean? You are a pioneer in this field. So I want to understand from you what it is, why it is being done, why is it required?
Okay, thank you. And it's an absolute privilege to talk to you about this topic because, this topic is not generally a blue-eyed topic for the, usual economist. So I feel so happy to talk about gender in economics because in the recent American Economic Association conference I went, there was a panel on, people talking about their work on gender in macro policy or a public policy. And Janet Yellen was also there on board. So one of the inferences, it was quite shocking that why economists are not working on this topic. Because in general, men and women, the young economists, they feel that they will be sidelined in the career if they work or if they focus on gender and the macroeconomic policy, because it's a kind of oxymoron. Like if you're talking about gender, you better talk about gender into the the new institutional framework or the household economics, but why you have to come to the public policy? And when you talk to the macroeconomists, they often ask you what gender has to do with macro. It's much of a micro concern. So this is where I began with, and it was a young revolution. A group of economists from the heterodox school of thought, they came globally, thinking about how we can integrate the gender concerns in the macroeconomic policy framework. And, we brainstormed. It was like an international working group on gender and macroeconomic policy. And first, it was like a brainstorming at the research level, and later, a recognition from the public policy, makers, how to integrate that into the different components of public policy, like fiscal policy or trade policy and monetary policy. They have not yet begun the work. So this is the way it began. It's a group of economists who thought about this process. And if I remember, the background was everything was articulated in terms of economic growth. So nothing, for the economist, nothing beyond economic growth. So this was an imperative to take the discussions or to push the frontiers beyond economic growth, because economic growth and human development, these are not synonymous. And if you think that, economic growth is ensured, that will naturally get translated into a better gender aware human development process, that's not going to happen. So it was a push, pushing the frontier from the economic growth paradigm. And if you look at the macroeconomic policy framework, the entry points, the logical entry points to talk about people mattered policy initiatives were almost nil, because if you look at the analytical framework of a macro policy, it's quite rigid. And now you can appreciate the transition happening in the economic policy framework from the discretion of policymakers to the rules. So, for example, for instance, if you look at monetary policy, it's inflation targeting. If you look at the fiscal policy, it's a fiscal rules or the fiscal austerity measures. So within this rigid framework, the moment you talk about the people mattered or the human development related concerns, you're not going to get a specific space. So that was a challenge, and it's a young revolution. It happened around this globalization process started that time. From the trade policy perspective, there was a clear feminization view that was happening. And this feminization view, that phenomenon, is like why the women's economic, participation in the workforce is declining first and increasing later. Why that feminization view is happening, why it is responding to the economic growth, not in a linear pattern. So these were the initial questions that economists asked, and we were trying to sort out. And later on, it came to the fiscal policy and monetary policy. I don't know, we have not yet talked, but I'm so glad that Christine Lagarde in ECB, she started talking about integrating the climate change in monetary policy framework. But the human development initiatives or the gender perspectives in monetary policy, it's not at normal. But in the fiscal policy framework, the scholars have asked correct questions before me, and it was easy for me to ask questions in the context of Asia Pacific region. And now it may look normal, but it was a silent revolution, and it's hardly 2 decades. Yeah, that's the way it began with.
And so when you say that human development will be integrated, or gender issues will be integrated into macroeconomic policy, monetary policy, trade policy, or fiscal policy, it's already being done. Does this mean that, for instance, you have inflation targeting, which when it's flexible, it looks at growth or employment, unemployment, and it also looks at interest rates? You will have variables representing gender issues in that framework, monetary policy framework. Is that possible? Is that the direction they're likely to move into?
A wonderful question, but nobody has asked these questions, Pooja. But I'm glad that you're asking this question regarding the inflation targeting and how we can integrate the human perspectives to it. As you rightly pointed out, it's not about the single target, like we have to, adjust our policy rates based on the inflation expectations and also the output gap. And in this output gap, it's naturally the deviation of the actual output from the potential output. So my question is, how do you arrive at this potential output? So this potential output, the way you arrive right now, is through an econometric process by taking out the cyclicality, and you call as a trend component, and that trend component is your potential. But if you integrate what you have lost out, like if you integrate the non-market economy into it, that is a statistically invisible huge portion of your market economy which is non-monetized. And if you think in terms of getting the insights and talents of the workforce participation which is not in the yet in the market, so if you think in those terms, then your potential output is going to be up rather than stagnating at that level. But we have not started asking those questions. But as you rightly pointed out, in the context of native economies, they have a question of employment. But in our country, its employment is not an objective of monetary policy framework. It's different. It's like now not even growth, because we know that it is just the interest rate targeting, and we are just into the inflation. But there will be a review soon whether this inflation targeting is there good or not. But the way finance minister talks about integrating gender into macro policy, not even a single central bank governor has started speaking about the gender or human development concerns, other than the recent debate on the climate change, how to integrate that into the monetary policy framework. That's why I was telling that it's quite rigid. And one of the things we need to tackle before we get into the macroeconomic framework to integrate these concerns is to work with the statistical invisibility of unpaid care economy. So when we talk about the economy, it has two components. One is the market economy, and the other is an invisible care economy, which is unmonetized. But in 1993, Systems of National Accounts by the United Nations Statistical Division has appropriately pointed out that we need to extend the prediction boundary and integrate what is economic activity at this non-monetized sector, because economic activity is an economic activity whether it is monetized or non-monetized. So many of the work done at the informal, at the household and the societal levels, these are not getting captured. So they count it and kept it as a satellite accounts, but it is not integrated into GDP because of the pricing methodology or something. Because the moment we get the data ready from the time use or some other innovative statistics, then only we can start looking into how to measure this. So one of the major issues of recognizing this issue is how to measure gender development or how to measure human development. And this measurement issues were quite strong because GDP could not contain the human development perspectives. And that revolution happened, that we started constricting the human development index, but it may not be containing all the human perspectives of the choices of the people into the three dimensions within the human development index. But that measure, how to measure beyond GDP, how to measure a gender aware human development became a major question. And in this measurement issues, before getting into the policy, it's a journey actually. You look into the theoretical constructs of macroeconomic frameworks, macroeconomy, and you understand that the theoretical constructs are not integrating the human perspectives. Then from the theoretical constructs, you're getting into the data and the empirics, and then get into the public policy. So this is a journey. So how we began with the theoretical constructs, that it is beyond GDP, that is very important. Then coming to the data was quite constrained, and we need to have innovative data to capture this process. Then time use survey was floated, and then getting the insights from them, from these inferences, then how to incorporate that into the public policy narrative. So this is the way that thread, if I look at, I can, tell you. Yeah.
So you're saying that, we need to do this in a sequence. We need to first look at the theoretical models and see where these issues, gender issues or human development issues can be integrated. In order to integrate them into the empirical models that are used, we would need data and statistics. So new data systems will have to be designed. But does that also mean, like you said, that GDP only counts the monetized part of the economy. It does not account for the care economy, which for the benefit of my listeners, if you could also explain the difference. Are you saying something that, for instance, a bottled water, mineral water is counted in GDP, but if a woman goes and fetches water from a well walking 10 kilometers, that does not get counted in GDP, but it should actually count in GDP. Is that what you're talking about? That difference?
Yeah, wonderful. That's a concern, and you have explained it so nice. That's what, if you take the time chronology of a woman, let's do it qualitatively and then come to the quantitative perspectives. As you pointed out, when we look at it qualitatively, a woman may be spending 5 hours or 10 hours to collect the water, and then she's, or maybe fuel load, but the moment you are going to impute the value to what is the output or what she has collected in terms of fuel load, if it is 1 quintal, you are assigning the same value to both women, like the woman who traveled half an hour and the woman who traveled 1 hour. You're going to give the same value. As you rightly pointed out, the intensity of the efforts of a woman is not getting captured the moment we go for a pricing methodology. That is one. Second is, in this revolution, what has happened in the systems of national accounts is like you categorize the kind of, the time chronology into 3. One is the systems of national accounts kind of economic activities which get into GDP already. Then the second category is extended systems of national account framework. That is, after the UNST extended the production boundary, what are the new kind of economic activities which is not monetized but getting into the GDP, getting into the as economic activity. And the third category is a non-SNA, like certain things, like certain values, like loving your kid, on your behalf, I cannot love your kid. So those kind of things, or those kind of personal care or something, we are not going to compute. But in the time chronology, something is statistically invisible, but it is a clear economic activity or a clear work as per the ILO definition that needs to be integrated. And then only the policy formulators will be able to understand what is statistically invisible. Because if we focus only on the monetized, the GDP part, the overall well-being of the country will not be as much as if we incorporate the resource allocation and the decision-making process and the time chronology in this non-monetized sector where women and men do economic activity. So that's why the importance of the time you survey.
Understood. And will this involve, does it require because there is a debate even outside of this matter on, how accurately GDP represents economic activity. So is a prerequisite for what you're talking, the updation of the definition itself of GDP, wherever it is possible to have a price value of economic activity at least?
Absolutely. And I remember you have written about this beyond GDP very recently. And this question you're asking that regarding the activities which we need to integrate into the GDP, the valuation process is a big concern in the sense, there could be a valuation from input side. You impute the market wages for the work which is done in the care economy. So may not be that wage specific to each of the work done in the care economy. So maybe in the wage hierarchy in the market, you take the minimum wage and impute to all the work done in the care economy, and you come with a value. And on the other hand, as we have already discussed, that you impute a pricing to it. So that can create a lot of problems because as you rightly pointed out, that the intensity of effort of a woman or a man in doing that job may not get captured. So there are kind of issues. And another valid argument, but I don't think it's valid, like you impute opportunity cost to it. But opportunity cost means you and me doing the same work. But the moment we impute the opportunity cost of Pooja and Lekha, we get two kinds of estimates. So there's a kind of in the range of estimates we get for that. So these are the measurement issues we need to deal with the moment we try to capture. But The objective of this exercise is to not to incorporate this invisible component into GDP and say that the country's GDP will go up the moment you incorporate women's unmonetized activity. No. The objective of this exercise is to say that there is a statistically invisible component which is care economy in the system, and unless we sustain that through proper public policies, the market economy, that GDP you are talking about, may not be sustained in the long run. So that's the point. It's not to show that my country's GDP is going to go up the moment I incorporate, the unmonetized invisible work done by women. No.
Sure, yeah, that I understand. And also, if you want to use your monetary policy or fiscal policy to be able to have, to be able to reach everybody and have the kind of outcomes that you want, then you have to be able to make sure that it reaches even the invisible, statistically invisible part of the economy, and therefore you need to incorporate it into your model. So that I understand. To come to fiscal policy, where you're saying that some work has begun. What does it mean when you talk about gender sensitive budgeting and fiscal policy? Is this simply making higher allocations for subsidies that are exclusively focused on women, say for example free education or bicycles for girls who go to school, or even subsidized public transport such as what was being talked about in the state of Delhi? Is it limited to that, or it's a larger subject than that?
Oh, thank you. It's larger. It's a broader picture. But as you rightly pointed out, more often we think that gender budgeting is only the specifically targeted programs a finance minister designed for a woman. No, because if you look at the recent policy initiatives in the energy infrastructure, energy infrastructure, nobody can even visualize what can be a gender component in the energy policy. But, our government has rightly integrated providing clean fuel for women belong to low income households. So if you're looking only into the, what you call the specifically targeted programs, which is below 1% of the entire budget, that's not exactly the entire gender budgeting, but that is only one component. And the broader picture is you apply a gender lens to the entire budget document. All the demand for grants you look into through a gender lens to identify the intensity of the gender into in the budget, all the detailed demand for grants. So if you do that exercise, you will be able to say that how much a country is spending on women. And this exercise, as a process, it was very tough to start. For instance, in our country, we began this exercise by integrating one clause in the budget circular. Yesterday, the budget circular was sent, you remember. So in the budget circular, one of the clause or one of the thing is like you have to look into your demand for grants through the gender lens and identify what your sector has done in terms of gender, not only in terms of specifically targeted programs, but also in the mainstream programs. Is there any intrinsic gender component to it? Identified. That transparency is very much important to have accountability, and we can call that gender budgeting is an accountability tool. So that's one thing. And in this exercise, the methodology, if you remember in the first gender budgeting statement, which was produced by Government of India in 2004, there was a statement that it's not only we are identifying the specifically targeted programs for women, wherever possible, you have to apply a gender disaggregated public expenditure benefit incidence analysis to capture the distributional impacts of your spending. So these kind of methodology, it's only in the paper, but no sectors, it is impossible to look into all the programs or all the demand for grants through that BIA or the benefit incidence framework. But at least for the major programs of a sector, what is this incidence? What is the benefit incidence? So that is not yet done. And in a way, you are right that the progress is happening only in terms of specifically targeted programs for women, but it needs to be ideally a benefit incidence of the mainstream spending as well, and also to look into what is the intrinsic gender component of your mainstream or the other kind of public spending. And it was very difficult to ask that question. I remember in 2000, one of the recommendations proposed by the pioneering studies by NIPFP was, can you integrate this into the classification of budgetary transactions? Because mainstreaming gender into the budget means it has to enter into the classification of budgetary transactions. So that time it was very tough, like opening a budget head on gender development. Then similar kind of exercises were talked about, like you have a tribal subcomponent plan, you have already done it on tribal. Then we had some kind of debates with the planning commission economists, like can it be done the way the tribal subcomponent plan? But now this question is irrelevant because we don't have a plan. And that time, the major exercise of gender budgeting was to take the initiatives or the gender lens from the plan to the entire budget. Because in the 9th 5-year plan, the first initiative was to integrate 30% of all the developmental schemes or the programs need to be earmarked for women. But it was a big debate, as you rightly pointed out, where earmarking or specifically targeting, can it be called as a gender budgeting? So that was a big debate. Then we understood that ad hoc earmarking of some kind of a percentage like 30 or 33 is not going to, give adequate impact the way it can give unless we integrate that in or mainstream it into the entire classification of budgetary transactions. And it's not only in the context of India, in the context of Philippines, they have done it legally mandatory that all the development programs, 5% need to be a gender and development budget, and that needs to be spent on women. So it's a kind of sidelining of these issues to just 5% of your entire budget. And it was considered as an upper bound. So these kind of things can happen the moment we get into earmarking. It's a second best principle. So different countries have experimented gender budgeting in different manner. It's not a homogeneous framework. In Korea, what happened is in the national finance law, they have incorporated certain articles related to gender budgeting in the entire public financial management framework. It's not only the financial inputs, but it was linked to outcome process also. So there are different exercises or different innovations under the overall gender budgeting framework, and each country interpreted or in a different manner, or each country implemented that question in a different manner.
And when we say gender sensitive budgeting, basically what we're saying is that whatever allocations you're making from the budget, how is it going to help neutralize the disadvantages that women face historically purely because of the gender that they're born into?
Absolutely. You have taken the paradigm away from the equal opportunity framework. Before gender budgeting, if you look at before gender budgeting, what we interpreted is that schools, colleges, all this public service provisioning is there. People can come and access it. But if that happens, over the years, our country would have been different if that equal opportunity framework, but it didn't work. That's why the point you mentioned here, removing the unfreedom of the people or removing the logical entry barriers of the people to come and participate in the economy, that is also a public policy. And gender budgeting is a public policy of, that category. As you rightly pointed out, it's not an equal opportunity category, but to remove these logical entry barriers because of many cultural and other kind of non-economic constraints. So whatever, otherwise, economy develops only for 1% or 2% of the people. That's not the way. So that's the new kind of interpreting the public policy. Yeah.
So it's a far more active approach than, say, simply reserving seats or simple affirmative action. You're actually saying that, for instance, we know that women are not able to attend evening classes in colleges because it's not safe for them. So therefore, we will address the safety issue so that they will be able to attend evening classes in colleges.
Absolutely.
That would be an example of doing this.
Absolutely. That's a wonderful example. And other examples, the moment you look into the benefit incidence analysis, in this income quintiles, Q1 to Q5, different income quintiles, you can identify that why the public service provisioning is captured by the Q5, but not by the Q1. then the entire purpose of the public policy is not served. So then you identify the reasons why the people are not accessing the health care, why the people are not accessing the school, which is absolutely free. Or you take the case of immunization. Immunization is free in our country, but why mothers not taking the baby to the immunization camp? And this question, it is done by it was analyzed by Duflo, and she got Nobel Prize.
Nobel,
But
yeah.
I yeah, and the point is, I disagree with Duflo the way they have framed that experiment, in the sense, of course, immunization is free in our country. Why a mother is not taking the baby to the camp? So if I have to frame a gender budgeting policy, I will not frame it, just like the way Duflo framed that question. What she has done is, she has done the control experiment by providing lentils in certain camps, and that's a control experiment. So the women responded to the camps where the lentil was provided. But if you ask me, gender budgeting is giving lentil, if that kind of a policy, but that's short run. In the long run, how we can make that agency work in her, and she naturally take her baby to immunization camps. In the IFPRI studies, also in the nutrition related studies, you can see that it's empowering women is different than providing lentil. But lentil is, of course, a short-term effective policy, but in the long term, the gender budgeting cannot be like incentivizing the woman.
Yeah,
It has
you
to
have
be,
to make her feel equal, an equal
absolutely.
part of the economy. And this is not going to make her feel equal. This is just giving her, it's a magnet maybe, but it's not going
Absolutely.
to make her feel equal. I was
Absolutely.
saving a question for the end, but I think it probably is better to ask that question at this point, in the conversation. And the question is that, we are recording this episode at a time when there's so many cases of gruesome violence against women in, the state of Uttar Pradesh. Some very terrible news, very disturbing situation there. And we do understand that there are many complex causes behind what has happened and what has been happening. The social reasons, political, economic, institutional, both social institutions as well as administrative. Uh, I wanted to get a sense from you. Can a gender sensitive approach to macroeconomic and fiscal policies in any way help this particular problem that we have had in this country? Do these policies have a role to play? And I ask this because, when the last time such a big case had happened, the Nirbhaya case, a Nirbhaya fund was set up. Uh, has any study been done for us to know if it has in any way had, any positive outcomes in addressing these problems?
Yeah, it's a very sensitive question, and now the interface between the caste and gender is also on board. Like, we cannot imagine that all women are equal, because that kind of gender budgeting policy is no longer valid the moment the caste dimension comes into picture. So this is a recognition that gender budgeting policy cannot be homogeneous, considering all women are equal. Accepting that,
And
in
Duflo's
yeah,
lentil
yeah,
and Duflo's framing of the problem again will not work, when you have
absolutely.
these kind of barriers.
Absolutely. Yes. Of course, we need to see so many categories. Absolutely. I appreciate that point. And what happened in 2012, in December 16th, you know, uh, but the country, we, we responded, the policymakers responded to the crisis by doing it from the legal side and from the fiat side, because this unfortunate event has happened in December. We responded in the finance minister responded by incorporating the Nirbhaya component in the gender budgeting. That was a good step. But as you rightly pointed out, why that good policy that has not translated into outcome? That's a question of fiscal marksmanship we grapple with, especially for the social sector. What is budgeted and what is really actual, there is a significant deviation between these two, and we need to look into these forecasting errors, not only at the aggregate level of deficit or tax or expenditure, but at the disaggregated levels in the social sector and also in terms of gender components. Then only we will be able to understand why the responsiveness of a finance minister to this issue by allocating that was a good framework, but why that has not yet worked. And second point is in the Bill of Rights, which was proposed by the Justice Verma Committee report. That report, I heard that many scholars from Oxford and Cambridge, they were working day and night with him and the crew to come up with a report within 30 days. The government had to perform. And in that, one of the major things we always miss is look into the Bill of Rights they proposed. It is a charter, and that charter, it is quite aware of the capability deprivation framework of Amartya Sen. The way he was articulating the capabilities, functionings, and the commodity space framework. So that is not just a report which looks into the age, of the criminal. It's not that. It is quite aware of the gender issues, and this is a document which is still unexplored. And the moment we can translate the Bill of Rights into the budgetary commitments, and the moment we design that, at the public policy level, we get some specific policy tool to respond to this crisis of gender as a social justice. So justice is an important subject of gender budgeting. It has not yet effectively implemented just because we have so far done only a Nirbhaya fund, which is not yet translated completely into the outcomes. And the other kinds of issues which were highlighted in the Bill of Rights of the administrative framework by the Justice Verma Committee recommendations, we have not even touched into those kind of aspects, and we need to look into that, and maybe that could be a beautiful starting point. And third, I also want to tell you that when Nirmala Sitharaman ma'am was in National Women's Commission, that time she commissioned a study on gender budgeting, and she was taking an inventory analysis that time. And in the process, she came to NIPP for a consultation. So she was, talking a lot of things about how we can integrate gender budgeting into the classification of budgetary transactions. So that was her main question that time, I remember. And second question, as she was working closely with the National Women's Commission, she was aware of these issues. And she was talking to me, one instance, I still remember what she has told me is like, more women in the police station or one-stop centers, all these cannot solve this problem, because we need to prevent it ex ante, because now the policy is like, once the event is happened, how we are going to respond to that. No, what she was highlighting is that how we can prevent it ex ante. It's not about the short shelter homes for women or putting more women in police stations. So this kind of ex ante thinking process, and it has to happen at the fiscally decentralized levels as well. So this kind of ex ante gender budgeting framework, it has not developed in our country. Most of the things we are doing it ex post. And ex ante, what has happened? Yeah, tell me.
And it involves, I don't know how you can incorporate it into gender budgeting, but I think it also involves, cultural and institutional frameworks. For instance, nobody tells a young child that, you should not commit murder. It is illegal to commit murder. Little boys pick it up on their own. They pick it up from the institution of family, extended family, or social relations, neighborhood, etc. But I find that even in the cities, some grown-up men don't know how to behave with women. So, this is also at many levels a cultural and a social institutional issue. Can that part of this problem, which is probably the bigger part of this problem, can that be, and it involves caste also, often these are caste crimes, can that somehow be addressed through gender sensitive budgeting?
Absolutely. And you are right. Like we have to deal with the big picture, and the specific tool we have is just a small brush to to work with, and that is fiscal policy tool. Fiscal policy tool is not everything, but the moment high constitutional bodies like finance commission or a finance minister talk about these issues in our country, that has got its own impact. I'm not telling that the unit of analysis of a gender issue is just what's happening within the household. The public policy, what's a role it can play to change this perspectives. For instance, discrimination against gender starts in our country even before birth. The sex ratio is adverse if you look at the 0 to 6 ratio, and all the cultural and other non-economic factors you have mentioned to me right now, they are the significant determinants. But at the same time, what we can do with this limited policy tool, the fiscal policy, to address these issues. So I was asking this question, and one of the ways, but I don't know whether the 15th Finance Commission is going to seriously integrate any kind of a gender related criteria into the framework. But of course, in the process of correcting the demographic dynamics, they have incorporated the TFR, and TFR is not constructed in vacuum. As you rightly pointed out, TFR is constructed on the base of many cultural and other societal, and it's very much a variable which can reflect the women and the child's health related aspects or many things. So that question, so Finance Commission, the moment they ask back what we have to do with gender, the talks fail. But if the moment they think that we can also do something relating to the gender, because the moment climate change is incorporated into the TOR of a Finance Commission, can gender or a human development perspective be far behind? So they have done it already, but indirectly to address the demographic concern. But I look forward to this report, the final report in October, in which anything proactively done in terms of integrating gender. And two ways we can respond to this. One is the conditional or unconditional. The moment we are doing it through the unconditional transfers by integrating gender into the criteria, then states have to take the lead in formulating the policy, because it's not the top down. But at the same time, the moment we argue for a specific purpose grant to deal with the gender issues at the subnational level, the moment we give a menu of activities, then the flexibility of the finance is limited. So we have to, play very judiciously how we can integrate gender criteria into the intergovernmental fiscal transfer framework. But things are possible, though it's a limited tool. Things are possible because macroeconomic policy tool of monetary policy, our central bank governor has not yet asked a question. And what Janet Yellen is highlighting is the kind of governance issue and the participation issues, like a woman. How many women are there in the central bank? From the ECB side, also the Isabel. The kind of debates I have read is like the kind of invisibility of the women on board. But we have not yet seriously thought about the way you were asking in the beginning. Like in the macroeconomic policy framework, fiscal policy has done something to integrate gender, but what monetary macro is going to do? So these kind of questions, I think it's still getting innovated. And we hope that, some research will be there on board from the monetary policy side as well.
I'd like to draw the first part of this conversation to an end at this point. Next week's episode will play its concluding part, in which Lekha shares her views on the challenges in integrating gender and human development issues into macro policy.